All right, CNT120, we are working on our Chapter 3 lab. First thing we'll want to do is our lab direction page. We'll want to download a copy of this when we get to the lab room. There are parts of this lab that we are disconnecting from the internet, so we would lose access to our Google Doc, if you will. So I would make sure here, download as Word or PDF. I download as a PDF. And then here it is right there. But what I did was I created it in the documents folder. I created a little CNT120 Brown, and then I have one here for Chapter 3, and I put the file there and I launched it from there. That way I have all my stuff for Chapter 3 lab there. That'll be the first thing we do. Second thing we do, we are going to do some of the lab in Windows and some of the lab in Linux. So I'm going to get the virtual machine booted up before we talk about anything else. So on the desktop, you'll have a link to VMware Workstation. Launch that. When you do, you should have a view that looks like so. On the left should be a little library of different virtual machines on here. We'll be looking for CNT120 Mint. If for any reason this is not here, go to View, Customize, and Library. Make sure that's selected. If that's not selected, that goes away. So View, Customize, Library here. We'll be looking for the 120 Mint image, and we are going to boot that guy. So highlight that, and we'll do Power on Virtual Machine. So in this lab, we are going to look at layer 2 MAC addresses on both Windows and Linux. We're going to look at static and dynamic IP4, static and dynamic IP6, and again, we're going to do it on Linux and Windows, so we'll be able to communicate between the two. We'll look at some port numbers with a protocol analyzer, and then we'll look at some domain name stuff at the application layer. So we'll get a chance to hopefully get our fingers on or touch each of the addresses that we talked about in Chapter 3. So here in this first podcast, let's take a look at some MAC address info. We already have our Windows machine up and we're logged into it. So over here on our virtual machine, we're going to log in with CNT class, just like the desktops in the room. So now we have our Windows machine that we're currently using, and now we have a Linux virtual machine that we can use to do some of the commands that we read about, the ifconfigs and those kind of things that we read about in the chapter. All right, so we'll kind of do these side by side. I'll end up doing like the Windows here, and then I'll come over and do the Linux so we can kind of compare the two as we go. So first thing, we want to look at the MAC address on the Windows side. So I'm going to open up the command prompt here on the bottom bar. That is our Windows command prompt. I'll minimize this for now just to keep the confusion down. So I'll open up my command prompt, and remember, if I do ipconfig, that's only going to show the IP address configuration. We want to see all of it, so we're going to do ipconfig /all. Again, watch your typing, watch your syntax. Extra spaces or getting rid of spaces can cause the command not to work correctly. We want to look for the Ethernet 3 properties on this PC. Now, the reason I'm saying that, I'm going to open the device manager here real quick. We go to device manager, and if I go to the network adapters here is our network adapters. The one that's built in, we have two built in. We have a wireless built in, and we have the Intel Ethernet connection here built in. This actually is the one we're using, and it's going to actually show up as an Ethernet 3 on our connections, okay? So we'll be looking for this Intel Ethernet connection in our output. So I'm going to scroll up here, and I'm going to go to the Ethernet 3. Here it is right here. And if I look here, it says Intel Ethernet connection. That is the wired NIC we're using, that one right there. That's how I know that's the one. So we're looking for Ethernet 3. And in here, here's the Intel Ethernet NIC that we just looked at. This is the physical address. This is the MAC address of this PC. And actually yours in the lab room, these first 6 will be identical because all these machines are identical. They're made by the same manufacturer. So the first half will be identical in all of ours. The last half is going to be unique for your PC. So there is the MAC address on my Windows machine, and I want to gather that result. So I'm going to open up a notepad file. So down here, I'm going to click the start button, if you will, and I'm going to type in notepad. And I'm going to start gathering my Windows results here. So I'm going to give this a label, CNT120 Chapter 3 Lab, and I'll put here Mr. Brown. That way we know it's my file. And then we're going to do layer 2. Actually, I'll put a note here. This is my Windows data. And we'll say layer 2 MAC address. That's what we're looking for. And we are going to paste in I really just want the beginning of this, down to like here is fine. If you give me all of it, that's okay. But I really just want this part here because I want to see the Ethernet adapter 3, the Intel NIC, and its MAC address. So I'm going to highlight that, and I can try a Control-C. The other thing that works on a command prompt here is if I hit the Enter key. Either one of those will copy that data. I'm going to come over here, and I'm going to right-click, paste it, and there should be my layer 2 MAC address. Now, before I go any further, I'm going to save this file so I can save my data. So let's do a Save As, and I'm going to point it to that folder that I created, CNT120 brown, and I'm going to point it to my Chap3Lab folder. You do the same kind of thing, okay? And I'm going to give this a name here. I think I'm calling this CNT120 Chap3Lab. I might call this Windows Data or Windows. Yeah, I just did Windows.txt. And leave the TXT extension, and I'll do Save. And now that should be saving to my, here's my direction file, and there's my Windows file. My data here should be saving for the lab. And I would just kind of save that, and I'm going to minimize it because I'm going to add to it as I go. Well, now let's do the exact same thing. I'm going to close my command prompt because I'll come back to it later. Let's do the exact same thing on the Linux machine. So I'm going to open up my virtual machine here. Here is my Linux VM. Down on the bottom bar is the Linux, icon, if you will. That's kind of like the Windows Start icon. If I click on that, that gives me access to everything here. And I have a couple different ways I can get to it. I can type in here network, and I should be able to pull up the network settings and go that way. And that'll get me what I need. Okay. The other thing I can do is down on the bottom bar, I can go to here, left click, and go to network settings. This gives me the actual network setting icon and network settings on this PC. So we are eventually going to be changing stuff here. But if I look here, the network connection, it actually shows me the MAC address, the hardware address, the MAC address right there. So that is one way I could see it on this machine. The other way I could see this is, I'm going to close that out. We're going to go to the command prompt or the terminal prompt. Down here in the bottom bar, there is a link for the terminal. So we'll open that guy. And the command on this is ifconfig. ifconfig will give me my interface config information. Now, I don't need to do ifconfig all because in its output, here's the NS33, that is this virtual NIC, if you will. Here's the IP, and if I look a little more carefully, here's the Ethernet address. There it is right there. There is the MAC address of this machine. So the MAC address of this machine, ours should all be starting with 000C29 because I believe that is the prefix for VMware Workstation. I believe that's what it is. So the N will be unique on all of ours. Well, we want to capture this result as well. Well, what we're going to do is we're going to put the result on this machine, and we will eventually submit from here. So down here, I will click on the start bar again, and I'm going to put in text editor. There's a text editor on here just like the notepad on Windows. So I'm going to, on this one again, I'll do CNT120, Chap3Lab, and I'll put in here Mr. Brown, and I'll put in this as my Linux data, and I will put layer 2 MAC, and then I'm going to paste this result in here. I really just need this part here because this shows the Ethernet address. Here I'm going to do a Control-C, or I should be able to do a right-click copy, and I will come over here and go right-click paste. And I will save this data. So let me do a file save as. And again, I think I'm going to go to documents on here. We're in the student login. I'm going to go to documents, double click. I should be able to do a new folder here, and I will put in here Brown CNT120 folder. And here's the documents. Here's the CNT120 Brown. And I will save the file here. And again, I will go, CNT120 Chap3Lab. And I will call this Linux. And I want to make sure I add a .txt to this. I want to make sure I add that on here so that it saves that for me. So I'll do a save. And if I want to find that, okay, I'm going to go down here to the folder, to the browse. We're kind of working our way around. Here's the documents folder. There's my Brown folder, Brown 120, and then in here should be my Linux document. So I know kind of where I have this thing saved. Alrighty, I will close that out. And I'm going to leave this handy because I'm going to add to this as I go. So there is my Linux MAC address and also my Windows MAC address. So I'm going to have two files. I'm maintaining one on the Linux machine that I will submit later from this virtual machine, and then I have one out here on the Windows that I'm going to submit from here to D2L when we get to the end. So just kind of keep those saved, file save. I'm going to minimize that. I'm going to go here. I'm going to make sure I go file save and just make sure I'm keeping this data up to date. So there is my layer 2. We'll come back in the next podcast and start working on layer 3.